Well, hello, my name is Andy Tidy and welcome back to another edition of Canal Hunter. In my last episode, we had taken our loaded coal boats down from the top of the Perry Barr locks to lock number 10 College Road. And there we kind of just ran out of time to do the story justice. So this is really a continuation of the previous episode. So in this episode, I'm going to complete our journey down the last section of the Tame Valley Canal, which includes locks 10 through to locks 13. This is lock number 10, right next to the College Road. And this lock and this bit of canal is a bit special for me. See, this was the section of canal that I used to cross over every day on my way to work. And every day that I came past, my eyes flicked up and down the canal in search of some movement. And it was gradually this interest from going to work and seeing this fleeting glimpse of the old Perry Barr flight of locks that rekindled my interest in the local canals. Now, these days, there's not an awful lot to be said for this lock number 10 at College Road. It's simply backed by some 1960s industrial site. It's not beautiful, it's a bit noisy, and it's a bit down at heel. But it does contain a fabulous little story, and I'd like to tell it to you. At the dawn of the 20th century, Enoch Mason and Joseph Mason, his father before him, worked on the BCN. And they lived on Pear Tree Lane on the far side of the Titson and the Netherton Hill. But then, in about 1930, the family relocated to a cottage, number 83, which stood just on the far side of the lock here. And in order to relocate the family, they loaded up a dayboat full of their possessions, they legged it through the Dudley Tunnel, and then they hauled it all the way down here. This was the site of two very basic waterways cottages. They were single story, they were without electricity, and they were without sewage, and they were without running water. And the Mason family continued to occupy number 83 right up until 1964, when they moved into the dormer windowed bungalow at the top of the lock flight. Life in this primitive waterways cottage centred around a massive black iron grate. This was lovingly polished every week, and it was the centre for the family. It was used for heating, for cooking, and the family just lived around it. There was the other cottage next door. There was a blacksmith's forge out the front, and there was a brew house out the back which contained laundry. For many years there was no toilet apart from a brick-built one at the end of the garden. Eventually this was connected to the main drains, but even then it tended to freeze in the winter, so they had to take a gallon of hot water down to thaw it all out. Now, this story of Enoch has been recounted for the benefit of the Birmingham Canal Navigation Society by his granddaughter Janet, and she remembers coming to visit her grandparents in this cottage. She remembers how the cottage looked, how it was lit by a spluttering gaslight in later years, and how, when she had her weekly bath, they trotted her down to the brew house after all the washing had been done in the copper, and she was popped in the copper later on. Enoch Mason worked for the waterways for 45 years. And in addition for his lock minding duties, he tended the horses as they came past, replacing them with shoes in the forge at the front of the house. And in the winter time, he worked the icebreakers which kept the canals open, and on the side pulled out the horses who slipped into the water. But most of his time was spent at the Perry Barr pumping station, just beyond Deacon Avenue, maybe half a mile across what were the meadows to the south. Anyhow, enough about reminiscing of places and people from the past. Let's carry on down this flight of old locks, see what else we can find. Now, just below College Road, there is lock number 11, and beyond that, the site of the Perry Barr well. Rumour has it that water extraction rights still exist for CRT, although the wellhead is somewhere in the middle of the British Car Auctions car park. We've arrived at the bottom of the 4 College Road locks, and we find another one of these low brick-built structures. This one has lost its top, which means we can see in somewhat more clearly. And there are the remains of the old valve system that controlled the pumps. Here in front of me there appears to be a gate valve for the main supply, which would have taken the water uphill from the pump. And then across to the left there is another one of those reflux valves, which, if necessary, could be opened, the flow of water reversed, and the water drained out of the pans above to give access so that the waterways could do maintenance. And consistent with the previous one, which we saw up near the Alexander Stadium, there's also another air relief valve just tucked into the side here. In fact, it even says number 3 AV, number 3 air valve. And this squat building is parallel with the site of the old Birmingham Perry Barr waterworks. And my assumption is that the Perry Barr borehole does continue to work and feeds this section of the canal down through here and on to Spaghetti Junction and the Birmingham and Fazeley beyond. Now, the supply of water to the Birmingham waterworks is a story all of its own. Birmingham was a growing city, and like many cities it relied on the wells in its locality, but of course these soon became poisoned with industrial effluent and sewage, so they had to find another source. And they had 2 options. They had the River Rhea, which itself was fairly polluted, or up here on the River Tame, where the ground was much cleaner and the water still came out pure. So it was up here on the River Tame that they dug out the first water supplies. But literally within years of the well being dug and the water supply system being initiated, feeding the reservoir at Aston, there was a chemical spill which resulted in the water being unfit for human consumption. So after that, they decided it was unwise to have all of their water supplies in one bucket, so to speak. So they dug a deeper well down at Minworth, and they abstracted water there and used big steam engines to pump the water up the hill into the growing city of Birmingham. It's probably worth putting Birmingham in a bit of a context. We're talking about 1860 here, and at that time the town had grown to about 60 or 70,000 people. But 90% of those people lived within a 1-mile radius of what is today the Bull Ring. So it was very much Digbeth and Saltley. And it was at that time that the canals coming into the city very much came up to its boundaries. You had Gas Street and Newhall at the top of the hill, and then from the bottom of the hill you had the Grand Union coming into Fazeley Street. But literally immediately outside of that radius it was all open fields, farmland, water meadows and water mills. So it's a reasonable guess that once the Perry Well had ceased to function as water supply for the growing city of Birmingham, a couple of miles just across to the southeast, that it should be reused as a supply into the canal. Now in the end, even this water supply coming in from Minworth was inadequate to supply the growing needs of the city. And it was at that point that Joseph Chamberlain, the then mayor of the city, decided on a radical solution. They bought land all the way over in the Ellen Valley in Wales, nearly 100 miles away. And they built a huge dam, a huge aqueduct, and a pipeline made of iron, very similar to the one we've seen on the back pumping scheme, which brought water supply by gravity all the way across to here and the city of Birmingham. That water supply still exists, although I must say the supply pipes have been enhanced. But even today, the citizens of Birmingham enjoy a plentiful supply of soft water from the mountains of Wales, albeit slightly tinged with a layer of rust. Anyhow, we're now moving down the long pound which separates the 4 College Road locks, with the final 2 as we approach the industrial area. And all along this line we have been playing toe to toe with the M6, and it's the M6 that I'm going under right now. The wharves along here were for the old GKN works. Obviously all long gone. They didn't need side basins because they had such an enormous canal frontage. Lock cottages number 79 and probably 78. Alongside Lock 13 there were 2 lock cottages, plain buildings just in here, and then beyond them the pumping station at the far end. This is the site of the Perry Barr pump house. Not even the foundations remain. Mr. Mason's pride and joy. His granddaughter remembers seeing the water wheels spinning around to control the flow, and the pipes gleaming, having been polished endlessly. All now in the past. This old pumping station lifted water from 302 feet to 408 at the top, the Walsall level. Initially, the old pump house used 3 beam engines, but in 1895 these were replaced with 2 much more efficient triple expansion engines. And these engines continued in use right through until 1958, when the need for back pumping became redundant because the volumes of traffic flowing up and down this canal had dwindled away. The pumps do, however, have one last claim to fame. They were the last operating recirculating pumps on the BCN. Well, until the modern electrical ones came along. And that brings us to the foot of the Perry Barr locks. We've completed the new 13 and very much the end of the back pumping scheme. The final built structure is the one you see behind me, the grid house. This was the entrance valve that allowed water to come in from this bottom level and to be pulled up by the pump just above this lock and then pushed all the way up to the Wolverhampton level 106 feet above us. Anyhow, we are very quickly approaching Journey's End, and if you look straight down the canal you can see where this canal comes to a very rude and very abrupt halt. Immediately to the right of the canal below the locks there was the mighty GKN's electrical works. They've all been eradicated and the land repurposed, but rather nicely the old chimney still stands in silent testimony to an industry long gone. only memento apart from the chimney is the road which runs through the middle of the site, curiously called Electric Avenue. I suspect that has very little to do with Eddie Grant. And so as the Thames Valley Canal enters its final lap coming through Witton, it enters a somewhat surreal, otherworldly area, a not particularly nice area, it has to be said, because here, standing at the foot of a confluence of communication routes, the old canal runs under Gravelly Hill intersection, better known to all and sundry as Spaghetti Junction. When Spaghetti Junction was first in its planning phase, a member of the Evening Mail described the plans as looking like a mix between a plate of spaghetti and a failed attempt at creating a Staffordshire knot. Well, 50 years on, and the name has stuck. So we've arrived at Journey's End for the Thames Valley Canal. We have arrived at Salford Junction, although most people will of course know it as Spaghetti Junction on account of the motorway above us. Here beneath the rumbling elevated section of the M6 lies a largely forgotten relic of the Industrial Revolution, the Aston Well pumping station. From here, the water that had been collected from the wells above was stored in the Aston Reservoir. It's still there. And alongside the reservoir, there's a flat area of ground which is used for five-a-side football pitches. And they were the old filter beds. This is a busy confluence of transport conduits. You have the River Rhea and the River Tame, and they merge right beside me. You have the four canals which join at this point. You have the Thames Valley that I've come down. You have the Birmingham and Paisley, which continues on out to the coalfields around Polesworth. You have the line going back up into Birmingham through the Aston Locks. And finally, the route we're going to explore next, we have the Saltley Cut, owned by the Grand Union Canal Company. Having ridden all the way down the little used Perry Barr flight of locks, you may be wondering why the canal even exists at all. Well, the issue is one of drainage. Here in Birmingham, the canals make up a fundamental part of the city's drainage infrastructure. If you don't have the canals, you're going to have to put something else in their place. They discovered this when they did the Bentley Canal, and they spent millions inserting a box culvert underneath. Frankly, it's a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot simpler just to leave the canal as it is and give it a little bit of dredging from time to time. You can't reach Gravelly Hill intersection or Spaghetti Junction without throwing out a few of the amazing facts of this road intersection. The intersection serves 18 distinct roads. It involved the construction of 13.5 miles of elevated roadway like you see behind me. The junction itself involves 2.5 miles of slip roads. And the interlocking junction, which looks like this plate of spaghetti, is on 5 different levels and is supported by 559 concrete pillars. But one of the curious things about this construction is that a lot of those pillars had to be carefully sited in the middle of the canal or away from the towpath, because even when it was being built in the 1960s, horse traffic was still operating here. And the horses were pulling the barges, and they needed to have a clear way to drag the boats with tow ropes. So this very 20th century construction was actually built all around the old 1700s canal network which sits at its base. I'm told that the motorway junction has a design life of 150 years. Well, judging by the amount of repair work that's having to go on after just 50 years, I rather suspect that that's overly optimistic. And my other prediction is that these old canals sitting at the foot of the modern motorway intersection, well, they've survived 250 years. And I rather suspect that they're going to outlast this newfangled motorway thing that's above my head. Anyhow, time will tell, and I won't be here to see it. So that really is it for this edition of Canal Hunter. Hope you've enjoyed it. In our next edition, we're going to head off up the Saltley Cut, and we really will be digging into the heavy industry of a growing Birmingham. But until then, happy hunting, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio.